They say betrayal doesn't happen all at once. It's a thousand little moments of doubt, 100 ignored instincts, and one final blow that leaves you breathless. For me, that blow came in the form of a letter I wasn't supposed to find, a letter that tore my world apart. I never thought my life would come undone in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. The day began like any other. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and my husband, Andrew, sat at the table, scrolling through his phone like he always did. At 55, I'd convinced myself that my life was steady, predictable even. Sure, Andrew had been distant lately, but I told myself it was just the natural ebb and flow of marriage after 3 decades together. He had always been my safe place, my rock. But looking back now, I realize that safe can sometimes blind you to the cracks forming beneath your feet. It all started when I went into his study that afternoon, searching for a spare set of keys. Andrew had always been protective of his office, but I'd never thought much of it until that day. There in the bottom drawer of his meticulously organized desk, I found the envelope. It was sealed, tucked beneath a pile of old bank statements. At first I hesitated. It felt wrong to open it, like crossing a line we'd silently agreed never to cross. But something about it, the weight of the paper, the sharpness of Andrew's handwriting on the front, sent a chill down my spine. Do I trust him enough to leave this alone? I asked myself. And that's when I realized trust wasn't the issue anymore. It was fear. Fear of what I might find. With trembling hands, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. My heart pounded as I scanned the words. Words that would set my world on fire. The contents weren't just shocking. They were cruel. They pointed to a secret life I hadn't known existed. A betrayal so deep it made my stomach churn. There were references to a woman named Marissa, cryptic mentions of financial dealings, and something about a settlement agreement. I could barely make sense of it all, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. This can't be true, I whispered, clutching the letter like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. Andrew had always been careful, meticulous even. How could someone so calculated let something like this slip through the cracks? Unless he thought I'd never look. The sound of the front door slamming snapped me out of my daze. Andrew was home. I shoved the letter back into the drawer and closed it as quietly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely move. When he walked into the kitchen, he greeted me with the same calm smile he'd worn for years, the same familiar tone. "How was your day, Clara?" But now that smile felt different, like a mask. And for the first time in our 30 years together, I didn't know if I could trust the man I had built my entire life around. I had always thought betrayal would feel like a sudden, violent act, a single moment that changed everything. But as I sat there, staring at the man I once trusted with my heart, I realized that betrayal doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, quietly, until one day you're left wondering if you ever truly knew the person beside you. Before I dive deeper into this unraveling tale that left me questioning everything I thought I knew, I want to pause and connect with you, my wonderful viewers. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. And if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or found strength in a moment of heartbreak, hit that like button. You're not alone, and together we can navigate these twists and turns. That evening, the world around me felt different. The house that had always been my sanctuary now seemed cloaked in shadows, every creak of the floorboards a whisper of secrets. I sat across from Andrew at the dinner table, watching him, studying him, the way he avoided my gaze, the way his hands lingered a little too long over his phone, face down as always. Everything seemed deliberate, calculated, and I couldn't shake the weight of what I had read. The words from the letter replayed in my mind like a broken record. Who was Marissa? What settlement? My instincts screamed that this wasn't just a financial matter. It was something more, something personal. But Andrew, he sat there as if the universe hadn't just tilted off its axis. I wanted to confront him right then and there, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The part of me that still clung to the idea of us held me back. Instead, I forced a smile and tried to play along. "How's work been?" I asked, my voice tight, strained. "Busy, as always," he replied without looking up. It was a lie. I could feel it in the way his tone wavered, the way his fork clattered a little too loudly against his plate. But I said nothing. Instead, I decided to bide my time. Later that night, when Andrew had fallen asleep, I crept back into his study. My heart pounded as I opened the same drawer, pulling out the letter again. This time I noticed something I'd missed before, a small smudge of ink on the corner of the envelope, as if Andrew had hastily written it in a moment of panic. Why the rush? What was he hiding? Determined to uncover the truth, I searched through the drawer. Papers, receipts, and notebooks spilled out, each one a potential clue. And then, tucked beneath a stack of old bills, I found it. A small black notebook. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but inside every page was filled with Andrew's handwriting. Dates, names, amounts of money transferred, all meticulously documented. My stomach twisted as I read through entry after entry. Marissa's name appeared again and again, alongside large sums of money. And then I saw it, a name I hadn't expected. Lila. My heart stopped. What could my daughter possibly have to do with this? The room spun as questions flooded my mind. Was she involved? Did she know? Or worse, was Andrew dragging her into whatever scheme this was? The weight of betrayal grew heavier, suffocating me. My hands shook as I clutched the notebook, desperate for clarity but terrified of what I might find. This wasn't just about Andrew anymore. This was about my family, my daughter. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Over breakfast, I brought up the letter, testing the waters. "I found something in your study yesterday," I said, keeping my tone casual. Andrew froze for just a moment, so brief it could have been imperceptible, but I caught it. He quickly recovered, his expression neutral. "Oh? What did you find?" I stared at him, searching for a crack in his armor. "An old letter, from someone named Marissa." The color drained from his face just for a second, but it was enough. He knew. He knew I had seen it. "Clara, it's not what you think," he said, his voice laced with that practiced calm that once reassured me, but now only enraged me. "Then what is it?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because it looks like you've been hiding something from me. From us." Andrew sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's complicated." "It always is," I said bitterly. And just like that, the facade cracked. Andrew's calm demeanor gave way to irritation, then defensiveness. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his tone harsher now. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I snapped, but he didn't. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door without another word. As the door slammed shut, I sat there, staring at the empty chair across from me. The man I had trusted with my heart, my life, was now a stranger. And for the first time, I wondered if I had ever truly known him at all. That evening, the silence in the house was deafening. Andrew's absence lingered like a shadow, stretching across every room, filling every corner with questions I couldn't yet answer. I paced the kitchen, my thoughts racing. The letter, the notebook, Marissa's name scrawled over and over. None of it made sense. But the one thing I couldn't shake was the mention of Lila, my daughter, my heart. She had always been my grounding force, my reason to keep going even on the hardest days. The idea that she could somehow be involved in whatever this was, it was unthinkable. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Lila had always been an early riser, so I found her in the backyard, sipping coffee as the sun painted the horizon in soft pinks and oranges. For a moment, I hesitated. She looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm brewing. "Lila," I began, my voice trembling, despite my best efforts to stay calm. She turned, her smile faltering when she saw the look on my face. "Mom? What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the chair as I sat down across from her. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her brow furrowed, concern flashing across her face. "Of course. What is it?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a copy of the notebook page with her name on it. Her eyes widened the moment she saw it, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Lila stared at the paper for a long moment, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, she sighed, setting her mug down with a shaky hand. "Mom, I didn't want you to find out like this." My heart sank. "Find out what, Lila? Please, just tell me." She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "It's complicated. Dad, he told me not to say anything. He said it would only hurt you." "Lila," I said firmly, leaning closer, "I need to know the truth. No more secrets." And then it all spilled out. Andrew had approached her months ago, asking for her help with what he called a family matter. He had framed it as a way to protect me, to shield me from something he claimed I wasn't ready to handle. Lila, trusting her father, had reluctantly agreed. But as time went on, she began to suspect there was more to the story. She had seen the money transfers, overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear, and even met Marissa once, though Andrew had assured her it was all business. "I didn't know what to do," Lila admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all work out. But now, I don't know anymore." Her words hit me like a wave, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just Andrew who had kept secrets from me. It was my own daughter. I wanted to be angry, to lash out, but the sight of her sitting there, broken and guilt-ridden, softened something inside me. She had been caught in the same web of lies, manipulated just like I had been. "It's not your fault," I said finally, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But we can't let him keep doing this. We have to figure out what's really going on." For the first time, I saw a spark of determination in Lila's eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "We'll do it together." That night, as the house fell into an uneasy quiet, Lila and I pored over every piece of evidence we had. The letter, the notebook, the bank statements, each clue painted a clearer picture of Andrew's betrayal. It wasn't just the money or the secrecy. It was the manipulation, the lies, the deliberate way he had driven a wedge between us. And as we pieced it all together, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a calculated, deliberate act to control us, to keep us in the dark while he orchestrated a life we were never meant to be part of. But now the pieces were falling into place, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel: hope. The following morning, the weight of the truth settled over me like a thick fog, but with it came a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Lila and I had uncovered enough to confront Andrew. This time, there would be no running, no deflection. I was done tiptoeing around the man who had torn our family apart. He came home that evening, his footsteps echoing through the hallway as if he owned the space. The audacity of his calm demeanor, his unbothered whistle, made my blood boil. I stood in the living room, Lila by my side, the notebook and letters spread out on the coffee table between us like evidence in a courtroom. "Andrew," I called, my voice steady but sharp. He stopped mid-step, turning to face us. His eyes flickered from me to Lila and then to the table. For a brief second I saw it, the crack in his carefully crafted facade. But then it was gone, replaced by the mask of indifference he wore so well. "What's this?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes betrayed him. "You know exactly what this is," I replied, crossing my arms. "No more games, Andrew. No more lies. It's all here. The money, the notebook, the lies about Marissa. We know everything." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you figured it all out? Clara, you don't know half of it." "Then enlighten me," I shot back, refusing to back down. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice low. "This was never about hurting you. It was about control, keeping things in order. You've always been too emotional, Clara, too naive. I did what I had to do." "Don't you dare put this on me," I said, my voice rising. "You lied to me, you used me, and you dragged our daughter into this mess." Andrew's gaze flickered to Lila, and for a moment I thought I saw a hint of regret. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "Lila made her own choices," he said, his tone icy. "And if you're smart, you'll both drop this." You don't want to know what's at the end of this road. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But I refused to let him intimidate me. We're not afraid of you, I said, my voice firm. Whatever you're hiding, we'll find it. And when we do, you'll have no power left over us. Andrew smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. You've already lost, Clara. You just don't know it yet. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking with rage and determination. Lila reached for my hand, her grip steadying me. We're not giving up, she said softly. No, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. We're not. That night, Lila and I decided to take our investigation further. If Andrew wouldn't give us answers, we'd find them ourselves. We combed through his emails, his financial records, even his social media accounts, piecing together a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what we had imagined. What we uncovered left us breathless. Andrew wasn't just hiding money, he was hiding an entire life. Transactions tied to luxury hotels in cities he'd never mentioned, photos of him at events I'd never heard of, and names of people I didn't recognize. And at the center of it all was Marissa, not just a mistress, but a business partner, a co-conspirator in schemes that siphoned money away from our family and into her accounts. The betrayal burned deeper than I thought possible. Andrew had built an empire of lies, and I had unknowingly been a pillar holding it up. As the hours stretched into the early morning, Lila and I sat in silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on us. I could feel the tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This isn't the end, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We'll take him down. Together. Lila nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sadness. He doesn't get to win. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had a plan, and no matter how much Andrew had taken from us, he hadn't taken our will to fight. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about reclaiming our lives, our dignity, and our strength. And for the first time, I believed we could do it. The days that followed felt like walking through a minefield. Every glance from Andrew carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a silent warning that he knew we were digging deeper. But if he thought his intimidation would stop us, he was wrong. With every revelation, Lila and I grew more determined. We were no longer just uncovering the truth, we were preparing for battle. It was during one of our late-night searches that we found the email. Hidden in a folder labeled innocuously as receipts, it was addressed to Marissa and referenced an upcoming final transfer. My heart sank as I read the words. The implications clear. Andrew was planning to move the remaining funds out of reach, leaving us with nothing. The deadline was 2 days away. This is it, I said, my voice trembling. If we don't stop him now, we lose everything. Lila leaned over my shoulder, her face pale but resolute. What do we do? I didn't have an answer, not yet. But I knew one thing. Confronting Andrew directly wouldn't work. He was too manipulative, too practiced at turning situations in his favor. We needed to outsmart him, to catch him in a way he couldn't deny or escape. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. I explained everything, what we had found, what we suspected, and the danger we believed Andrew posed. The lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Kate, listened intently, her expression hardening as I spoke. We can act quickly, she said. If we can prove he's transferring marital assets illegally, we can freeze the accounts before the transfer goes through. It was a race against time. Lila and I worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence we could find. Emails, bank statements, even old photographs that hinted at Andrew's double life. Every detail felt like another crack in the foundation of the man I thought I knew. On the morning of the transfer, Kate filed the paperwork to freeze the accounts. I could barely breathe as we waited for confirmation. Hours felt like days, every minute stretching endlessly. When the call finally came, Kate's voice was calm but triumphant. We did it! The accounts are frozen! Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Andrew came home that evening, his expression darker than I had ever seen. He slammed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the house. You think you've won? He snarled, his eyes burning with fury. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I stood my ground, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. What I've done is protect what's mine, what's ours. You don't get to control us anymore. His laughter was cold and bitter. You think this is over? Clara, you have no idea what I'm capable of. For a moment, fear gripped me. But then I looked at Lila, standing strong beside me, and I knew we weren't alone in this fight. Neither do you, I said, my voice steady. You've underestimated me for the last time. Andrew's threats hung in the air long after he stormed out, but I refused to let them break me. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The accounts were frozen, his plans disrupted, and the web of lies he had spun was beginning to unravel. That night, Lila and I sat together on the couch, exhausted but relieved. The battle wasn't over, but we had won a crucial victory. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that we could rebuild, that the life Andrew had tried to destroy wasn't beyond saving. I'm proud of you, Lila said quietly, her hand resting on mine. You didn't give up. I smiled, tears welling in my eyes. Neither did you. As we sat there, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. We still had a long road ahead, but we were walking it together. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally stepping into the light. The morning after our small but significant victory, the house felt eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that prickled at your skin, as if something was about to happen. I knew Andrew wouldn't let this go without a fight. The man I had lived with for decades wasn't the kind to surrender, not when his carefully constructed facade had been shattered. But I wasn't the same woman who had once believed his lies. I was done playing defense. Lila and I decided to take the day off from our investigation to regroup and catch our breath. We went for a long walk in the park, the crisp morning air carrying the faint scent of pine. For the first time in weeks, we talked about something other than Andrew. Lila shared stories about her college days, her dreams of starting her own business, and the places she wanted to travel. It reminded me of the bond we'd always had, one Andrew's manipulation could never break. By the time we returned home, I felt lighter, as if a small piece of myself had been restored. But the feeling didn't last long. As we walked through the front door, the sight stopped us cold. Andrew was sitting in the living room, his legs crossed, his expression calm but deadly. On the coffee table in front of him was a single folder, its edges worn, as though it had been opened and closed countless times. I thought we should have a talk, he said, his voice unnervingly smooth, before you dig yourself into a hole you can't climb out of. Lila moved to stand beside me, her posture defensive. What are you doing here? She demanded. Andrew leaned back, a smug smile playing at the corners of his lips. I live here, remember? Or have you both forgotten that in your crusade against me? We haven't forgotten anything, I said, stepping forward. But we're not afraid of you anymore, Andrew. Whatever you're trying to pull, it won't work. His smile widened as he tapped the folder with his fingers. You've always underestimated me, Clara. That's your problem. You think freezing a few accounts and finding a couple of emails is enough to beat me? You don't even know what game you're playing. My stomach twisted, but I refused to let him see my fear. And what game is that, Andrew? Enlighten me. He opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. This is what you're up against. I glanced at the documents, my eyes skimming over legal jargon that made my head spin. But one phrase stood out, power of attorney. You didn't, I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Oh, but I did, Andrew replied, his tone dripping with satisfaction. You signed it years ago, remember? It was all part of the estate planning. I made sure everything was in place, just in case. Lila grabbed the papers, her eyes scanning them furiously. You manipulated her into signing this, she spat. She had no idea what you were doing. Andrew shrugged. Intent doesn't matter. Legality does. And legally, I have control over everything. The accounts, the house, the business. All of it. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of his words crashing down on me. He had planned this for years, slowly, methodically stripping me of power, while I remained blissfully unaware. I had walked into his trap without even realizing it. But then, something shifted inside me, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. You might have the paperwork, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But you don't have me. You don't have my daughter, and you sure as hell don't have my loyalty anymore. Andrew's smirk faltered, just for a moment. That's cute, Clara, but loyalty doesn't matter when I hold the cards. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze head on. Maybe not, but I have something you don't. Integrity. And people will see through you. They always do. Lila, who had been silently watching, suddenly spoke up. You're right, Mom, and we're not done fighting. Andrew rose from the couch, his calm exterior cracking. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice laced with anger. This won't end well for you. Maybe not, I replied, my tone unwavering, but I'd rather lose everything than let you control me any longer. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoing through the house. For a moment, the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. But then Lila placed her hand on my shoulder, her touch grounding me. We'll find a way, she said softly, no matter what it takes. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Andrew might have thought he held all the power, but he had underestimated the strength of a mother and daughter united by love and determination. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and this time we would be ready. The house felt emptier after Andrew stormed out, but the air was lighter, as though his presence had been a suffocating weight we hadn't fully realized until it was gone. Lila and I sat in silence for a moment, letting the tension of the confrontation dissolve. The papers Andrew had left on the table stared back at us, a stark reminder of the battle still ahead. We can't let him win, Lila said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she picked up the folder again. We need to figure out how to fight this. I nodded, though exhaustion tugged at every fiber of my being. We will, I said, more for her than for myself. But first, we need help. That evening, I called Kate, our lawyer, and explained what had happened. Her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line confirmed what I already knew. Andrew's move was calculated and dangerous. Clara, she said, her voice measured but firm, this is serious. If he has power of attorney, he can control everything. But that doesn't mean he's untouchable. If we can prove he manipulated you into signing it or acted in bad faith, we can challenge it. Where do we start? I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. With evidence, she replied, and witnesses. Anyone who can corroborate that you didn't fully understand what you were signing. As I hung up the phone, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting what was mine. It was about reclaiming my autonomy and showing Andrew that he didn't hold all the power. Lila and I began reaching out to people who had been part of our lives over the years. Friends, colleagues, even old family acquaintances. Each conversation felt like peeling back a layer of Andrew's carefully constructed image. What we uncovered was a pattern, subtle but insidious. Andrew had a knack for positioning himself as the savior, the one who always knew best. It wasn't just with me, it was with everyone around him. His charm, his intelligence, his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage, it was all part of the facade. But cracks began to appear. An old friend of mine, Margaret, remembered Andrew insisting on being present when we signed the estate planning documents. He said it was just routine, she told me over the phone. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it felt off. Piece by piece, we built our case. It was exhausting, both emotionally and physically. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to let Andrew have his victory and move on. But then I would think of Lila, her strength, her unwavering support, and I knew I couldn't back down. The final turning point came when we discovered a series of emails Andrew had sent to Marissa. They weren't just about money. They revealed a deeper plan to consolidate his control and cut me out entirely. The emails were damning, filled with language that painted me as incapable, emotional, and unfit to handle our family's affairs. When Kate saw the emails, her expression hardened. This changes everything, she said. We can prove intent. This is the leverage we needed. The court hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Those days were a blur of preparation, anxiety, and moments of doubt. Andrew remained eerily silent during that time, which only heightened my unease. I knew he was planning something. He always was. The day of the hearing arrived, and as Lila and I walked into the courtroom, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. Andrew was already there, sitting confidently with his lawyer, his expression one of smug certainty. But I held my head high, refusing to let him see my fear. The proceedings were tense, every word feeling like a battle. Kate presented our evidence with precision and poise, painting a clear picture of Andrew's manipulation and deceit. Andrew's lawyer fought back, twisting the narrative to cast doubt on my competence and intentions. But the moment that shifted everything came when Lila took the stand. Her voice was steady as she recounted the ways Andrew had tried to control and isolate us, how he had used his power to manipulate not just me, but her as well. My father always wanted to be the smartest person in the room, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. But what he didn't count on was how strong my mom is. She's not the weak, naive woman he wants you to believe she is. She's the reason I'm standing here today. Tears filled my eyes as I watched her speak. In that moment, I knew we had already won, not because of the court's decision, but because we had reclaimed our voices, our power. When the ruling came in our favor, the relief was overwhelming. The power of attorney was revoked, and Andrew was ordered to return control of the accounts and assets. But more than that, it was a victory of the soul, a reminder that no matter how deep the betrayal, there is always a way forward. As we left the courtroom, Lila turned to me and smiled. "We did it, Mom." I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with pride. We did it together. The fight had been long and grueling, but as we walked into the sunlight, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. Andrew's shadow no longer loomed over us. We were finally free. The weeks following the court ruling were a whirlwind of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and an odd sense of grief for the life I had thought was mine. Andrew was gone, his presence reduced to a few bitter memories and the lingering scent of his cologne in the study. The silence he left behind felt strange, but it also felt like possibility, like the first deep breath after years of suffocating. Lila and I began piecing our lives back together, one small step at a time. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of everything hit me, leaving me staring at the ceiling late into the night, wondering how I had let things go so far. But each morning brought a renewed sense of purpose, and with it, the realization that we were stronger than Andrew ever gave us credit for. One afternoon, as I sorted through boxes in the attic, I found a photograph tucked between some old papers. It was from our wedding day, Andrew's arm draped over my shoulders, his smile so convincing it was hard to believe it had all been a lie. I stared at it for a long time, a mixture of sadness and anger welling up inside me. "What are you going to do with it?" Lila's voice startled me. She stood in the doorway, watching me with that same quiet strength she had shown throughout the ordeal. I held up the photo, the corners fraying with age. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to burn it. Part of me feels like I should keep it, to remind myself." Lila stepped closer, taking the photo from my hands. "Keep it," she said gently, "not because of him, but because it's part of your story, and your story isn't over." Her words stayed with me. That night I sat down at the kitchen table with a journal I hadn't opened in years. I began to write, not about Andrew, but about myself, about the things I had lost, the things I had found, and the strength I had discovered in the process. The words flowed like a river, each one a step toward reclaiming my narrative. As the days turned into weeks, life slowly began to feel normal again, though it was a new kind of normal. The house was quieter, but it was also filled with a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. I started tending to the garden, something I had always loved but had abandoned during the chaos. The simple act of planting seeds and watching them grow became a metaphor for my own journey. Lila, too, began to blossom in her own way. She took the bold step of starting her own business, pouring her energy into something she was passionate about. Watching her thrive filled me with a pride I couldn't put into words. She was proof that even in the face of betrayal, we could build something beautiful. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lila turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about what's next?" The question caught me off guard. For so long, I had been focused on surviving, on putting one foot in front of the other. The idea of what's next felt almost foreign, but as I looked out at the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, I realized that for the first time in years I had a choice. "I think what's next is up to us," I said, a smile tugging at my lips. "And I think it's going to be something good." She smiled back, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yeah, I think so too." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The past had left its scars, but it had also taught me lessons I would carry with me forever. It had shown me the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for myself, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. It was mine to shape, and for the first time in years, I was ready to embrace it. In the months that followed, life began to take on a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and freeing. For the first time in years, the house wasn't filled with tension, with unspoken accusations hanging in the air. It was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that came with healing, with the promise of new beginnings. I found myself rediscovering things I'd forgotten I loved. Mornings became sacred, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise, feeling the warmth of the light on my face. The garden, once overgrown and neglected, was now bursting with life. Roses and lavender, sunflowers and daisies. They all grew under my care, a reminder that beauty could flourish even after the harshest winters. One Saturday, as I pruned the roses, Lila appeared with a stack of papers in her hand and an excited glimmer in her eyes. "Mom," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm, "I did it! The business plan is done." I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and took the papers from her, flipping through the neatly typed pages. She had poured her heart into every detail, her vision for a sustainable lifestyle store that focused on community and connection. I couldn't help but smile. "Lila, this is incredible," I said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to run to me with every drawing, every accomplishment, eager for my approval. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You've shown me what strength looks like." Her words stayed with me long after she left that day. They reminded me that despite everything Andrew had taken, he hadn't succeeded in breaking us. If anything, his betrayal had forged a bond between Lila and me that was stronger than ever. That evening, as I sat in the living room, I found myself reaching for the journal I had been writing in since the court case ended. Flipping through its pages, I realized how far I had come, from the woman who felt lost and powerless to someone who had reclaimed her voice. The thought sparked an idea, one that had been lingering at the edges of my mind for weeks but had finally come into focus. What if my story could help someone else? The next morning I called Lila. "I have an idea," I said, my voice steady but filled with nervous excitement. "I want to write a book. About everything. About Andrew. About the betrayal. About how we came out stronger." There was a pause on the other end, and then Lila said, "Mom, that's amazing. You should absolutely do it." With her encouragement, I began drafting the outline that day. The words flowed more easily than I expected, each one a step toward reclaiming my narrative. It wasn't just about sharing my story. It was about finding purpose in the pain, about showing others that, even in the darkest times, there is a way forward. As the weeks turned into months, the book took shape. I wrote about the love I had once believed was unbreakable, about the cracks that appeared over time, and about the devastating moment I realized it had all been a lie. But I also wrote about resilience, about rediscovering myself, and about the unshakable bond between a mother and her daughter. By the time I finished the first draft, I felt lighter, as if I had finally let go of the last remnants of Andrew's hold on me. The book was more than just words on a page. It was a testament to survival, to strength, and to the power of starting over. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden with the completed manuscript in my lap, Lila joined me, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed me one and settled into the chair beside me. "So, what's next?" she asked, her tone teasing but genuine. I looked at her, my heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "What's next?" I repeated, smiling. "We keep growing, we keep building, and we never look back." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the garden. In that moment, surrounded by the life we had rebuilt together, I realized something profound. The story of my life wasn't just mine. It belonged to Lila, to every woman who had faced betrayal and found the strength to rise again. It was a story of hope, of resilience, and of the unbreakable spirit that carried us forward. And as I sat there, holding the book that carried my truth, I knew that our journey was far from over. It was just the beginning of something beautiful. The day the book was published felt surreal. I held the first printed copy in my hands, running my fingers over the textured cover and the bold title that seemed to echo my journey. Reclaimed, a story of betrayal, strength, and starting over. It felt heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in meaning. This wasn't just a book. It was a declaration, a piece of my soul captured in ink and paper. Lila stood beside me, her excitement spilling over as she snapped photos of the moment. "Mom, you did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "This is going to help so many people." Her words gave me comfort, but they also brought a pang of vulnerability. Sharing my story with the world meant reliving every painful moment, bearing my wounds for others to see. Yet as I looked at Lila's bright smile, I knew it was worth it. If even one person found solace or strength in these pages, it would be worth it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of book signings, interviews, and messages from readers. Women from all walks of life wrote to share their stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and, most importantly, resilience. Each letter felt like a thread, weaving together a tapestry of shared experiences, of women standing tall despite the storms they had weathered. One message in particular stood out. It came from a woman named Margaret, who had recently left an abusive relationship after reading my book. "Your words gave me the courage to leave," she wrote. "For the first time, I feel like I can breathe again. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone." I read her message over and over, tears blurring the words. It reminded me of why I had written the book in the first place. Not to dwell on the past, but to light a path forward, for myself and for others. One evening, as I sat in the garden, a warm breeze carrying the scent of blooming roses, Lila joined me with a laptop in hand. "You're trending," she said with a grin, turning the screen toward me. There, on a popular women's lifestyle blog, was an article titled, "How One Woman Turned Betrayal into Empowerment." I laughed, shaking my head. Trending? Who would have thought? Lila leaned closer, her tone softening. "You deserve this, Mom. You took something devastating and turned it into hope. That's powerful." Her words sank deep, filling me with a sense of pride and gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, far from it, but sitting there, surrounded by the life we had rebuilt, I realized just how far we had come. Andrew's shadow no longer loomed over us. It had been replaced by light, by possibility, and by a strength that could never be taken away. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a women's empowerment conference. Standing on the stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt a nervous flutter in my chest. But then I remembered everything I had been through, and the fear melted away. "I'm not here to tell you that betrayal is easy to overcome," I began, my voice steady. "It's not. It shatters you in ways you can't imagine. But what I've learned is that those broken pieces can be put back together. Not to recreate what was, but to build something entirely new, something stronger." The applause that followed was thunderous. But what stayed with me were the women who approached me afterward, their eyes filled with hope. They shared their stories, their struggles, and their dreams of starting over. Each one reminded me that this wasn't just my journey anymore. It was ours. As the conference ended and I walked out into the crisp evening air, Lila met me at the door, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. "You were amazing," she said, wrapping me in a hug. "I hope you know how many lives you're changing." I smiled, my heart full. "And I hope you know how much you've changed mine." We walked to the car together, the city lights twinkling around us. A reminder that life was filled with endless possibilities. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. Free to dream, to grow, and to embrace whatever came next. Because this wasn't the end of my story. It was just another beginning. And as I looked at Lila, her strength and love shining through, I knew that together we could face anything. The future was ours to create, one step, one choice, and one moment of courage at a time. The weeks after the conference felt like stepping into an entirely new chapter of life. My days were no longer consumed by the shadows of the past, but instead filled with purpose and connection. Messages from readers continued to pour in, each one a testament to the power of shared stories. Women from across the country, and even beyond, shared how my journey had inspired them to reclaim their own lives, to stand taller in the face of adversity. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, I noticed an email marked urgent in my inbox. It was from a literary agent, someone who had read Reclaimed and believed it had the potential to reach an even wider audience. They wanted to adapt the book into a documentary, a visual story that could give my words an even stronger voice. I sat back in my chair, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. A documentary meant reliving everything in a way that was even more vulnerable, even more exposed. But it also meant that the message could reach women who might never pick up a book, women who needed to know they weren't alone. That evening, I shared the news with Lila. Her face lit up with excitement. "Mom, this is huge. You have to do it." "But what if it's too much?" I asked, voicing the doubt that had been swirling in my mind. "What if it brings everything back?" Lila reached for my hand, her grip warm and steady. "You've already faced the hardest part, Mom. You've lived it. Sharing it with others isn't about reliving the pain. It's about showing them they can survive it too." Her words gave me the courage I needed. The next morning, I replied to the agent, agreeing to the project. Within weeks, a production team was at the house, setting up cameras and lights, asking questions that peeled back every layer of my story. It was exhausting and emotional, but it was also cathartic. Each retelling felt like releasing a piece of the past, making room for the life I was building now. The documentary premiered 6 months later at a small theater in the heart of the city. Lila and I arrived together, the air buzzing with anticipation. The room was filled with women from all walks of life, their faces glowing with a mix of curiosity and empathy. As the lights dimmed and the first frames appeared on screen, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. The documentary didn't just tell my story, it captured the strength, vulnerability, and resilience of every woman who had ever faced betrayal and found the courage to rise again. As the credits rolled, the room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the sound of clapping that stayed with me. It was the tears in the eyes of the women around me, the way they reached for each other, forming connections even in the darkness of the theater. After the screening, a young woman approached me, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I've been living in silence for so long, thinking I was alone. Watching this, hearing your story, it gave me hope." Her words were a gift, one that reminded me why I had chosen to share my journey in the first place. It wasn't about revisiting the pain. It was about transforming it into something meaningful, something that could help others find their way. As Lila and I left the theater that night, the cool evening air wrapped around us like a gentle embrace. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice soft. "Grateful," I replied, smiling at her. "Grateful for the pain, the lessons, and for the chance to turn it into something good." She slipped her arm through mine, and we walked in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling above us. The future no longer felt like a question mark but a blank canvas, waiting for us to fill it with color and possibility. Back at home, as I sat in the quiet of the living room, I thought about how far we had come. Andrew's betrayal had once seemed like the end of everything, but now I saw it for what it was, a beginning. It had forced me to confront truths I had ignored, to find strength I didn't know I had, and to build a life that was truly my own. Lila walked in with 2 mugs of tea, her face glowing with pride. "Here's to what's next," she said, raising her mug in a toast. I clinked my mug against hers, a smile spreading across my face. "Here's to us." As we sipped our tea and talked about dreams for the future, I felt a deep sense of peace. The past no longer defined me. It was a chapter in a story that was still unfolding, a story filled with love, strength, and the unshakable bond between a mother and daughter. And as I drifted to sleep that night, I knew with certainty that the best chapters were yet to come.